art, artist, thoughts, philosophy, biography. Michelangelo di Lodovico Vernozzi Simoni was born on 6 March 1475 in Caprese, known today as Caprese Michelangelo, a small town situated in Valtibrina near Arezzo, Tuscany. For several generations, his family had been small-scale bankers in Florence, but the bank failed, and his father Ludovico briefly took a government post in Caprese at the time of Michelangelo's birth. His father was the town's judicial administrator and podesta of Chiusi della Verna. Michelangelo's mother was Francesca di Neri del Mincio di Siena. The Brunetrios claimed to descend from the Countess Maltidi di Siosa, a claim that remains unproven but which Michelangelo believed. Several months after Michelangelo's birth, the family returned to Florence, where he was raised. During his mother's later prolonged illness and after his death in 1481, Michelangelo lived with a nanny and her husband, a stone cutter, in the town of Settignano, where his father owned a marble quarry and a small farm. There, the young boy gained his love for marble, as his biographer Giorgio Vasari said. As a young boy, Michelangelo was sent to the city of Florence to study grammar under the humanist Francesco de Urbino. Michelangelo showed to interest in his schooling, preferring to copy paintings from churches and seek the companies of the painters. Florence was at the time Italy's greatest center of arts and learning. Art was sponsored by the Signoria, the merchant goodlies, and wealthy patrons such as the Medici and their breaking associates. The Renaissance, a renewal of classical scholarships and the arts, had its first flourishing France. In the early 15th century, the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, having studied the remains of classical buildings in Rome, had created two churches, San Lorenzo's and Santo Spirito, which embodied the classical precepts. The sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti had labored for 50 years to create the north and east bronze doors of the baptistry, which Michelangelo was to describe as the gates of paradise. The exterior niches of the church of Orsan Michele contained a gallery of works by the most acclaimed sculptors of Florence: Donatello, Ghiberti, Andrea del Verrocchio, and Nani di Banco. The interiors of the older churches were covered with frescoes begun by Giotto and continued by Masaccio in the Brancacchi Chapel, both of whose works Michelangelo studied and copied in drawings. During Michelangelo's childhood, a team of painters had been called from Florence to the Vatican to decorate the walls of Sistine Chapel. Among them was Domenico Ghirlandaio, the master in fresco paintings, perspective figure drawings, and portraiture, who had the largest workshop in Florence. In 1488, at the age of 13, Michelangelo was apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. The next year, his father persuaded Ghirlandaio to pay Michelangelo as an artist, which was rare for someone that youth. When in 1489, Lorenzo de' Medici, de facto ruler of Florence, asked Ghirlandaio for his two best pupils, Ghirlandaio sent Michelangelo and Francesco Granacci. From 1419 to 1492, Michelangelo attended the Platonic Academy, a humanist academy founded by the Medicis. There his work and outlook were influenced by many of the most prominent philosophers and writers of the day, including Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Poliziano. At this time, Michelangelo sculpted the reliefs Madonna upstairs and Battle of the Centaurs, the latter based on this theme suggested by Poliziano and commissioned by Lorenzo de' Medici. Michelangelo worked for a time with the sculptor Bertoldo de Giovanni. When he was 17, another pupil, Pietro Torrigiano, struck him on the nose, causing his disfigurement that is conspicuous in the portraits of Michelangelo. Lorenzo de' Medici death on 8 April 1492 changed Michelangelo's circumstance. He left the security of the Medici court and returned his Jewish father's house. In that following month, he carved a polychrome wooden crucifix as a gift of the prior of the Florentine church of Santo Precipito, which had allowed him to do some anatomical studies and the corpse from the church's hospital. This was the first of several instances during his career that Michelangelo studied anatomy by dissecting cadavers. Between 1493 and 1494, Michelangelo brought a block of marble and carved a larger-than-life statue of Hercules. On 20 January 1494, after heavy snowfalls, Lorenzo's heir, Piero de' Medici, commissioned a statue made of snow, and Michelangelo again entered the court of the Medici. In the same year, the Medici were expelled from the Florence as a result of this rise of Savonarola. Michelangelo left the city before the end of the political upheavals, moving to Venice and thence Bologna. In Bologna, he was commissioned to carve several of the last small figures from the competition of the shrines of the Saint Dominic. In the church dedicated to the saints at this time, Michelangelo studied the robust reliefs carved by Jacopo della Correca around the main portal of Basilica of Saint Petronius, including the panel of creation of the Eve and the composition of which was to repair from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Towards the end of the 1495, the political situation in the Florence was calmer. The city, previously under debt from the French, was no longer in the danger as Charles VIII had suffered defeats. Michelangelo returned to the Florence but received no commission from the new city government under Savonarola. He returned to the employment of the Medici. During the half years he spent in Florence, he worked on two small statues, a child Saint John of the Baptist and a sleeping Cupid. According to the Convisi, Lorenzo di Prevenzio de' Medici, from whose Michelangelo had sculpted Saint John the Baptist, asked that Michelangelo fix it so that it looks as if it had been buried, so he could send it to Rome, pass an ancient work, sell it much better. Lorenzo the Michelangelo were unwittingly created the real value of the piece of the middleman, Cardinal Raffaello Piero. To the Lorenzo he sold it, discovered that it was a fraud, but was impressed by the quality of the sculpture and the invited artist on Rome. In the French ambassador to see the Holy City, Cardinal Jean de Breiz-Lagrius, in November 1497. Then he commissioned him to carve a Pieta, a sculpture showing the Virgin Mary grieving over the body of Jesus, and it is now located in St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo returned to Florence in 1499. Michelangelo was asked by Council of the Guild of Wool to complete an unfinished project begun 40 years earlier by Agostinio Reducio, the colossal statue of the Carona Marbles portraying David as a symbol of Florentine freedom, to be placed on the gable of Florence Cathedral. Michelangelo responded by completing his most famous work, the Statue of David, in 1504. The masterwork definitively established his promises as a sculptor of extraordinary technical skills and strength of symbolic imaginations. A team of consultants, including Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Filippo Lippi, Pietro Perugino, Lorenzo di Scredi, Antonio and Guglielmo de Segnalo, Andrea della Robbia, Cosimo Rosselli, David Ghirlandaio, Piero di Cosimo, Andrea Severo, and Michelangelo's dear friend Grancy was called together to decide upon its placement. Ultimately, the Plaza della Signoria in front of Palazzo Vecchio. It now stands in Accademia. With the competition of the David came another commission in early 1504. Leonardo da Vinci had been commissioned to paint the Battle of Anghiari in the council chamber of the Palazzo of Vecchio, the dispute between the battle between Florence and Milan. Michelangelo was in commission to paint the Battle of Cascina. The two paintings are very different. Also during this period, Michelangelo was commissioned by Angelo Doni to paint a Holy Family as a present for his wife Maddalena Strozzi. It is known as the Doni Madonna and hangs in the Uffizi Gallery. Still, it is the original magnificent frames which Michelangelo may have designed. He also may have painted the Madonna and the Child with John the Baptist, known as the Manchester Madonna, and now in the National Gallery, London. In 1505, Michelangelo was invited back to Rome by the newly elected Pope Julius II and commissioned to build a Pope's tomb. Although Michelangelo worked on the tomb for 40 years, it was never finished to his satisfaction. It is located in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome and is most famous for the central figure of Moses, completed in 1516. Of the other statues intended for the tomb, two known as the rebellious slave and the dying slave are now in the Louvre. During the same period, Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The composition stretches over 500 square meters of ceiling and contains over 300 figures, and its center on 9 episodes from the book of Genesis, divided into 3 groups: God's creation on the earth, God's creation of mankind, and their fall from God's grace, and lastly, the state of humanity as represented by Noah and his family. On the pendentives supporting the ceiling are painted 12 men and women who prophesied the coming of Jesus, 7 prophets of Israel, and 5 Sibyls, prophetic omen and classical world. Among the most famous paintings on the ceiling are the creation of the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the Dialogue, the prophet Jeremiah, and the Cumaean Sibyl. In Rome, Michelangelo lived near the church of Santa Maria di Loreto. It was at this time that he made the poet Vittoria Colonna Marchioness of Pescara, who was to become one of his closest friends until her death in 1547. Shortly before his death in 1534, Pope Clement VII commissioned Michelangelo to paint a fresco of the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. His successor, Pope Paul III, was instrumental in seeing that Michelangelo began and completed the project, which he labored on from 1534 to October 1541. The fresco depicts the second coming of Christ and his judgment of the souls. Michelangelo ignored the usual artistic conventions in portraying Jesus, showing him as a massive muscular figure, youthful, beardless, and naked. He is surrounded by saints, among whom Saint Bartholomew holds the dropping flayed skin, bearing the likeness of Michelangelo. The dead rise from their grave to be consigned either to heaven or to hell. Then Michelangelo was died on 18 February 1564 at age of his 88.